There are two parts to implementing every login: authentication and authorization. Conceptually, authentication is basically the process of telling the system you're trying to access who you are, and authorization defines what you do and do not have access to. It's sort of like an access control mechanism. In order to implement authorization with the identity framework, something called roles is used, and that defines what associated with the roles is a sort of access control mechanism. So consider this, if you want to conceptualize it, like job security clearance. People with different clearances have access to different things. For example, if a user is a part of a view role, they'll have the ability to view a website, if that's how the role was implemented. If a user is part of the write role, they will be able to enter information on that website. A user can be part of multiple roles, and the permissions a role has differs based on how the system was implemented. So there might not be a view role on one system, but a view role on another system. So the actual permissions associated with a role can differ. Okay, so let's get back to our system that we've been implementing all this time and create our user administration page. So go to controller and right click and add a new controller. We're going to create an empty controller this time, MVC controller, and press add and type in administration and click add. So the first thing we're going to be creating is the ability to view a list of the roles as well as create a role. That's going to be the basic functionality we'll start off with. So as you can see, our administration control has already been created. In order to create a new role, we'll need access to two things in Identity Framework. The first thing we're going to need to be able to do is modify roles, because we want to be able to create one. And the second thing we're going to need to be able to do is add users to that role. Although we won't be getting to that right away in this video, we will need that ability later. As a result, we're going to need access to two objects from the identity framework. So let's first create our controller by typing ctor, tab, and it'll automatically generate our controller for us. Next, let's import the role manager. And we will call it role manager. And the next thing we're going to be importing is the user manager. What these two things do is allow us to modify and work with the users and roles in Identity Framework. These are part of the Identity Framework library. So let's press Control period next to the red squiggly lines, and it'll allow us to enter. It'll automatically allow us to import the Identity Framework. So click OK, and boom, it's been imported. Let's see those red squiggly lines. We're going to do something that'll make our lives easier later on. If you remember how we made an application user, now we're also going to create an application role. This will allow us to extend the Identity Framework's role. Okay, so now we've created it, and just like like before, when we created the application user, we're going to also have to extend the identity role class. And okay, so if we wanted to add in anything to any additional fields to the application role class, we would just specify them in here, and just like with our application user class, we would have those additional fields, and it would automatically update our database with the changes. Next, let's go to our startup.cs, because if you remember before, when we created the application user, we had to specify to the identity framework that we were no longer using identity user role. So the first thing we're going to have to do is change identity role in our startup configuration services to application role, and save that. And then we're going to have to specify the role manager. So dot add role manager, and tell it to use the default role manager that we'll be using is the identity framework's role manager, but it's going to be accepting the application role now instead of the identity role. And then that is it. Is a method but not valid in the given context. And at the end of that, add in the circular brackets in order to finish it off. And that's all we have to do in order to use our custom application role in case we want to extend it later, which we won't be doing, but based on the modifications we made to application users, you should already have a picture of how to approach that. Now let's get back to our administration controller and specify that our role manager is going to be working with application role here, and our user manager is going to be working with application user. Okay, press control period and imported that. Now I'm going to create the classes that will store this information. I mean, create the variables. Okay, now role manager is equal to role manager, and user manager is equal to user manager. Boom. So now we have access to our role manager and our user manager. So the next thing we're going to do is create our create role class. So if you recall, every CRUD operation requires a post as well as a get method. The get method is used to initially view the page or get action, and the post is used for updating the information in the database. So let's first create our get action result, create role, and then boom, and we'll just return the view. Okay, and in our view, we're going to create a views folder. We're going to create a new subdirectory. We'll call it administration, because this is going to contain the Razor files that refer to our administration controller uses. And the first Razor file we're going to create is our create role Razor file. So we'll create a new view, and we'll call it create role. And the view returned by our create role action will automatically be this SHTML file. Create add, click add, and it'll generate it for us. All right. So here's our create role CSHTML file. And another thing we're going to need is a new view model. And that's going to be our create role view model. What this will do is accept the information we put in our form and allow us to enter in a role name. Okay, so create role view model and make a new property called string role name, and we'll make it required because we need this information. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is create our HTML script. So create a role using the Bootstrap class role. Create a new div and just define the size of the column. We want it to only be 4 medium columns. And I'm going to add in the header text, create a new role. Next, HR, this will create a line across our page, and we'll add an ASP validation. This will basically print out any errors that occur. A summary of it. Equals all, class equals text danger. This is another Bootstrap class that's created to make our lives easier. Div. Label ASP4 role name. So we're creating a label that'll pull the default role name information from our model, our view model. And next we'll create the actual input field. And the class, stating it's a form control. And finally, last but not least, if an error occurs with regards to this field, we will print out that information using the ASP validation for tag. Okay, we are done, and now the last thing that's left is to define the model. And that's we're using the create role view model. Save that, and I want this to be in our model's full namespace instead of our view model's namespace. That's personal preference, but you can do it however you want. But if it wasn't the view model namespace, you'd have to define it here. Okay, so we've created our create role, and if we view that in our browser by pressing the play button, this is what we'll get. So as you can see, because we didn't add a link to it, we had to go to it in the URL. And let's type in create roles. And it'll bring us to the following page, which has nothing on it, because we used create role instead of create roles. Okay, and this is our page. So as you can see, we have a create role header, create a role, and an input box. So what we're missing is the submit button. So let's add that in. Button type equals submit, class btn primary. These are Bootstrap classes that create the button's layout, and we'll say create role. So we added the submit button, but we haven't implemented the actual post method. And what this means is that the data won't be updated even if we were to click the information, click the button on that page. So let's add in the code to create the actual data update. So we'll create a HTTP post, action result, create role, and this time we're going to be accepting the create role view model because that's what our actual form, our create role form, is returning to us. So I will create the variable and then boom, we got our class. Now all we have to do is enter in the actual logic. So first we'll check in whether the form is valid using the form state, the model state. Okay, application role is equal to and name is equal to create role view model dot role name. So what this is going to be doing is getting our create role view model and assigning that value that it returned to our application role variable, which is what the identity framework uses. Next, we're going to create an identity result and see whether it's possible to actually create this role by giving it to the role manager. And if you recall, the role manager is what allows us to actually create roles in identity framework. It gives us access to modifying and working with them. We use to create a sync and then pass in the application role. Okay, so now we're waiting for that. And it's giving us an error. And the reason why it's giving us an error is because the type of method it is. Since we're using the wait function and this is create async, we need to specify that it's asynchronous method, which means that the program's not just going to stop for it. This could run in parallel each other, so you can. Okay, so now we'll check if result.succeeded. If that is true, what we'll do is return so we're going to create a new page in a moment called list roles, and that'll also be in our actually let's return to our regular page. For now we'll change that later. So return the view. And if not, we're going to iterate through the errors and add it. To our model state. This way, if you recall, in our create role razor view, we have an ASP validation summary. So by adding these errors to our model state, it'll print it out there if there is an error received. So we'll create the error and error.description, so that'll display to the user any errors that occur and the reason why. And finally, if it gets through that and there is an issue, we need to return the create role view model in order to display the data as well as the errors that are associated with it. Okay, so now in order to show you what's happening, since we now have the ability to create a role, let's open up our database SQL Server's Management Studio software and then start up our actual website in parallel. Okay, we'll connect to our database, open up our from scratch database, and if you look at the roles we have right now, there are none. Oh, there are some. Let's truncate this table, because I made those before while preparing this lecture for you. Okay, I'll delete these. Okay, they're gone. View it, there's nothing in there. So now let's go to our administration page and go to create role, and we're going to create a new role. Let's call this admin. And if you see, look here, there are no roles there. So create role. I created it. Let's see if it actually worked. No. So look, what is the issue? If we go back to our create roles CSHTML, if we look here, we're missing some code. Basically, what's happening is that we're not posting that information. So at the top of our div, we have to create a form wrapper and specify that we actually are posting the information. Okay. And finally, at the very bottom, we will end that form. So now, when we restart our code, it'll actually create the information in our database. Go back, create an admin role, and it says cannot create DB set for admin application role because this type is not included in the model for the context. Okay, so if you recall this error, the reason why it's occurring is because we didn't tell the application DB context that we're using the application role instead of the identity role. So we have to go to our data, application DB context, and if you recall over here, we're telling it that it's getting an application user, and then we'll add in a comma, application role, and string to identify what type of primary key it has. Alright, and that should work unless I'm forgetting something. But that should cover all our bases. Okay. Administration create role, admin. Just double check the roles, make sure nothing's there. Okay, create role. And boom. And now we have a new role, admin, and we have successfully implemented the create role functionality.